Hey guys, Mono here, and in this video I'll be explaining all the strikes currently available in World War III. I'll be going over their different use cases, what's effective when, which ones you should avoid, and which ones are generally considered to be the best ones. Now, it's not like there's 3 or 4 of them that are dramatically better than everything else in every situation. They are all fairly balanced, and especially with things like vehicles, a lot's going to depend on the specific unlocks that you've got equipped. So for example, a weaker tank with an anti-tank turret is going to do great against an otherwise stronger tank. So I'll do my best to try and explain and make sense out of all the options here and give you guys an idea of what to expect with each strike. A lot of the information here comes from discussions I've had with people on Discord and such, and do keep in mind that I'm basing everything on the closed beta, so things might get changed and rebalanced in the future. Make sure you check out the channel for an updated video if this video happens to be like a year old or something. Alright, let's get started. First of all, there's 3 slots for your strikes. The top one is for UAVs, which will either spot or jam the enemy, and there's different types of these with different costs and sizes. Then we have our artillery strikes, which can be guided missiles like the Mephisto and Hellfire, artillery like the Shrapnel RD, or bombing runs. And lastly, we have the slot for vehicles, which ranges from cheap aerial drones and land drones to full-scale tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Starting at the very top, we got 3 different types of a spotter UAV, and at first glance it might seem like the only difference between them is the size of the area they cover and their cost, but if you take a closer look, you'll see that the Barracuda is the only UAV here that will mark enemies on the map and on the HUD. The flying drone and the OTV will only mark enemies on the map, not in your first-person view, and that is a pretty huge difference that kind of makes the Barracuda the best one here. The OTV can be really useful if you're playing something like Sniper and you want to get a general overview of where you can find targets to shoot, or you want to drop some artillery somewhere and you want to see where the enemy is. But apart from that, it is way too expensive, I think, for what it is, and again, it doesn't mark enemies on the HUD. The Flying Eye is a bit harder to justify also because it is cheaper than the Barracuda, so it's faster to use at the start of a match and you can use it more often. But the area it scans is really super small, and it only marks enemies on the map as well, so I don't think it's worth it for the most part. However, if you're running a good squad with some friends, then having someone take this can mean a lot more spotting more often, so there is that. The jammers don't really have this issue as there's only 2 of them, with the Reaper covering a fairly large area and the UCAS covering the entire map. The UCAS costs almost twice as many points as the Reaper to deploy, so while the benefit of jamming the entire map is going to be really impactful when there's lots of enemy drones and vehicles around, or when your team is really struggling to capture some objectives, for the most part, the Reaper is just going to be way more cost effective. You can use it to cover the area you're currently playing on, or the objective you want to go to, and just have that jamming effect at a much lower cost. So as a general rule, I'd say pick the Reaper for the most time, and pick the UCAS for the late game, when preventing enemies from deploying their airstrikes or respawning on each other is going to be way more impactful. Remember that jamming does all sorts of things like disabling claymores and mines and all that. If you're squatting up with friends, I do recommend you run a mix of Barracudas and Reapers so you can always spot and jam the objectives that you're going for. Next up, we have different types of support strikes, so either missiles, artillery runs, or bombing runs. Starting off with the missiles, the Mephisto is pretty good against tanks, the Hellfire is really good against infantry, and also extremely cheap, and the Stormbreaker is better at tanks than the Mephisto and also slightly cheaper. Rocket strikes don't cover as wide of an area as artillery or bombing runs, but they do have the benefit of being able to be guided using the mouse, so this makes them especially useful for damaging tanks or APCs that are constantly on the move around the map. Bombing runs or artillery will either miss these vehicles or be avoided entirely if they're really good at the game, so these strikes are the best option you have at dealing with really good tankers. Neither the Mephisto nor the Stormbreaker will one-shot a tank, so ideally you want to lower their health a bit before you use the strike. either with some RPG rounds or a loitering drone or something else. If you drop the strike before doing any damage, they will just flee to their HQ before you can finish them off, so make sure you don't waste your strike points this way. The Hellfire costs only 1,500 strike points, which makes it one of the cheapest strikes available, but its explosion is fairly small, so it won't completely wreck everyone in an objective or anything like that. But it can be a pretty cheap way to deal with an entire squad if you catch them grouped up, or deal with a couple of infantry that are capping a point far away or something. One thing to keep in mind is that these missile strikes can get jammed by enemy vehicles, which will scramble the controls as the rocket is about to land. So if that happens, you're just gonna have to use something else to deal with the vehicles. Artillery strikes can be significantly more devastating than the rocket strikes, and they also provide an area denial effect for a few seconds, which can be great for delaying an enemy trying to capture a point. Out of all of these, I think the most effective ones are the shrapnel and anti-armor artillery. The anti-armor covers a small area, kind of similar to the flying drone in size, and does a ton of damage in a relatively short period of time. So if a tank or APC gets caught in it, it can very easily get destroyed. It lasts only 10 seconds compared to 30 for the shrapnel strike, but has the same number of shells landing, so it's a much more focused, more concentrated strike that can be really effective if, for example, you catch the enemy spawn vehicle with a cluster of infantry around it spawning in or something like that. As an anti-tank solution, it's not super effective for a few reasons. One is that the announcer will let you know when an enemy airstrike is coming in, so just moving when that happens is kind of all you need to do to completely avoid getting hit by the artillery. The other reason is that the area of effect, as I mentioned, is pretty small, so even if you start hitting a tank with it, it's going to be able to move out of the way fairly quickly and might survive the strike. And lastly, all the artillery strikes have a first shell that lands, then there's a pause, and then the rest of the shells start falling. So after that first one, you notice what's going on and you just take cover and avoid the strike entirely. If you're paying attention, that's something you can do, so they're not really super effective as an anti-vehicle thing. Despite this, it can be very effective if you're using it in tight spaces or objectives like C2 in Moscow, where vehicles might get a bit stuck because there's a lot of obstacles around and stuff like that. But overall, if your objective is killing a specific tank or vehicle, then I would 100% go for the Stormbreaker or the Mephisto. The Shrapnel RD, which is the anti-infantry focused variant, covers a huge area of effect, so it's pretty useful as a way to lock down an objective, and it lasts 30 seconds, so it will keep the infantry off an area for a pretty long time, which is very useful. However, in terms of actually getting kills, I think the anti-armor artillery is a bit better. The high explosive artillery is very mediocre without it really being good at anything, and the smoke RD is honestly just a bit of a joke. It lasts a very short period of time and covers a super small area as well, so it's not really worth using at all, even if it only costs 500 strike points. If it covered a larger area or lasted longer, then it could be useful paired with like thermal optics for your weapons or something, but as it currently stands, it is just worthless. Alright, lastly we have the bombing runs. Bombing runs are kind of like RT in the way that they cover a larger area than the missile strikes, but they're also pretty fast to deal damage. You can see a B-2 bomber fly overhead, so if you see this, move out of the way, because once it flies over, after a few seconds you'll get this super fast barrage all at once and it's over in an instant. But if it lands correctly, it can absolutely wreck the enemy team. So the noteworthy ones here are, I think, the JDAM, the WCMD, and the Napalm. Napalm is incredibly effective against infantry, but won't really do any damage to vehicles, and it does leave the ground on fire for a while, which will force everyone out of an objective, and you just gotta wait for it to extinguish. So it's really good at denying an objective for the enemy infantry. The WCMD is a nice mix that can finish off vehicles and destroy infantry alike, and it does have a fairly significant area of effect, and this cluster-like effect for the bombs, which is very cool and very effective against infantry. Lastly, the JDAM has a super long area of effect, which can completely wreck vehicles that are caught in its path, so it's really good in maps like Berlin or Warsaw, where the streets will naturally funnel down the enemy vehicles into positions where they can't really retreat from a bombing run. So yeah, I prefer using the JDAM in these maps and the WCMD or Napalm in more open maps like Polyarny. The JSO seems to me like a weaker WCMD with a very, very small area of effect, so it's really not worth it to use it over the other ones. Alright, and now we get to the largest strike selection available in terms of customization options, and that's the vehicles. There's a whole lot to go here, so I can't really possibly talk about every single aspect of every single vehicle and its possible loadouts and configurations, so I'll do my best to try and explain what to pick here according to what it is that you want to do. So first of all, we have the aerial drones. The quadcopter is just a little drone that you can use to scout around, mark enemies, and then you can get like 2 or 3 kills with it when you detonate it next to a group of enemy infantry. It's very easy to shoot and destroy, so be sneaky with it and be real quick if you want to be able to detonate it before the enemy takes them down. The loitering drone is an anti-vehicle drone, which can also be used as anti-infantry, and it's really effective at taking down enemy drones or damaging the bigger vehicles. This is basically the really easy way to damage a tank before hitting it with a Stormbreaker to finish it off. However, some vehicles will be running a jammer, meaning that the drone won't do any damage at all if you hit them. There's no way to counter this from basically the drone itself, so if a tank is using the jammer, meaning when you get close to it, you start getting jammed, go do something else with that drone. Don't waste it on that tank because you're not gonna do anything. The helicopter drone is, I think, really quite difficult to use effectively and can often just be 5,000 points thrown away because it's really easy to get one shot by a tank, so you gotta be really, really careful with it. Though it can be a pain in the ass when used correctly and when properly leveled up, because once you get it kitted out, you can have like rockets and bombs that you can drop on tanks and completely annihilate them. It's really, really good at that. But if you're new to the game, I'd say skip this one in favor of the cheaper drones or the tanks or the IFVs, because, you know, if you're looking to level up, spending 5,000 points for basically nothing at all is not a really good way to do that. Unless you're like super good with the helicopter in Battlefield or something and you want to try that out, then, you know, go ahead. The land drones are really awesome. They're really cheap and you can completely wreck infantry with them, which makes them a great option at the start of the round since there's not going to be a lot of bigger vehicles around that can destroy you in a single shot like a tank. You have 2 options, the Leviathan and the Scarab. The Scarab is a slightly hardier and more expensive but also bigger version of the Leviathan. Once everything is unlocked, you can pretty much use the same weapons on either of them, like the anti-tank rocket launcher or a machine gun or grenade launcher, but at the start I think the Leviathan is the better one of the two because it does have the MG, which is extremely effective at range against infantry, so you can just drive around killing people and run off before they can really start hunting you down with RPGs and stuff like that. The Scarab, on the other hand, starts off with an HE grenade launcher, which isn't really effective against infantry and not super deadly against vehicles either. So overall, it's a bit harder to level up. All of the drones are very weak to the jammer though, so that's kind of like the rock, paper, scissors design of the game. So if a drone is messing you up, dropping a jammer followed by some RPG shots or just plain shooting at it can be a great way to take them down. The Leviathan should be on everyone's short list of strikes though, I think. It's very good at what it does, it's extremely cheap, and being able to field it at the start of the game can give your team the upper hand. So yeah, I can usually get enough kills to make up for the cost of spawning it, which is very good. Alright, now we move on to the bigger leagues, IFVs, tanks, and tank destroyers. There's a lot of vehicles here, so let's start off with the basics. The T-72 is considered the best overall tank in the game by most people, I think. It's really fast and small, so hard to hit and very easy to zip around the map, which makes it better at avoiding getting RPG'd by infantry and stuff like that. However, I do think the T-72 is better in open maps like Moscow and Polyarny, while the Leo or Abrams might be better for more urban style maps like Berlin and Warsaw, where there's lots of buildings and stuff around you, so you can get RPG'd and ambushed more easily. So the size and speed of the T-72 might not be as useful as having better armor. But yeah, it will come down to personal preference. Just give them all a try and see what you think, and see which one fits your playstyle the best. The T-72 though, you can't really go wrong with it. It is an incredible tank and a really fun tank to drive, given how speedy it is. The IFVs are all fairly similar, with varying degrees of armor protection and slightly different weapons types and stuff like that, but I think the more mobile ones are the better ones. So the Wolverine and the Boomerang and the Martyr. The Boxer is just too slow, and though they are all very effective in the early game, they get completely outclassed by the tanks once those start showing up. And considering how cheap the drones like the Leviathan are and how effective they can be against infantry, I think the IFVs are just not a really good value most of the times. And it gets even worse because all of them get outclassed by the Ajax. The Ajax gets a tank gun, so it completely wrecks the IFVs and can also deal with tanks not head on, but if you catch them from behind or as a support to another fight or something like that, you can definitely win against tanks. The gun doesn't do as much damage as a regular tank because it fires HE shots, but it has an insane rate of fire, so it's really good at dealing with both vehicles and infantry alike. And at 4,000 points, it only costs 500 points more than any of the IFVs. And honestly, this should probably be like 4,500 points or 4,750 points or something, because it's a very, very good vehicle. And for me, at least, there's really no reason to pick an IFV over the Ajax. Lastly, we have the Anders, which just isn't very good. It's 5,500 points, so it's just too expensive for what it is. It's basically a more expensive Ajax, so there's really no point in using the Anders really at all, I think, right now. And that's gonna be it, guys. As I mentioned, it's impossible for me to cover all the possible loadouts and different variations of everything and properly tell you like, oh, this is bar none like the best vehicle and vehicle configuration in the game, because everything has a counter and there's always going to be a factor of personal preference and playstyle. But the good news is that almost every strike is both fun and extremely viable, and with the matches being relatively short, you get to try out different kinds of combinations. So yeah, it's all really good fun. So just have fun trying out the different strikes, and let me know down in the comment section what is your favorite vehicle or your favorite strike selection. And yeah, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please give it a like. Make sure you subscribe for more content on World War III, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope I will catch you in the next one.